TopMedTalk.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Mike Grocott to give the 2022 Tom Crean Plenary Lecture. Mike is probably well known to many of you. He's a collaborator, friend and mentor/boss at Southampton and has been a real leading figure nationally and internationally in supporting perioperative care and research as things such as the chair of the National Institute for Academic Anaesthesia. He's an NIHR senior investigator. He is quite recently the director of our Southampton NIHR Biomedical Research Centre and recently ex-vice president of the Royal College of Anaesthetists. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mike to give this year's Tom Crean Lecture.
Thank you, Mark, for a kind and exhaustive introduction. So this is our first Tom Crean Lecture, and hopefully by the end of it you'll see why we have initiated a Tom Crean Lecture. It'll be a little bit different in that there's very little medicine. I'll squeeze a little bit in at the end. Actually, there's a little bit in the middle as well. There's not a lot of science, but there is a wonderful story of a very special and particular individual who has great resonance in this particular area. Easiest to start this story using the famous introduction from Star Wars, a long time ago in a place that's far, far away, because a lot of this story revolves around Antarctica. And I think as you hear the story, bear in mind that the long time ago was really very different. It was technically nothing like the world we live in today. Tom Crean, who was born in 1877, was born before the first car. He's born only very shortly after the first telephone. Steel-hulled ships with propellers. The first steel-hulled ship with a propeller was SS Great Britain was 1845, but they were still only just coming into regular use, and a lot of long-distance travel was by sail. The aeroplane wasn't to be invented for another few years during his lifetime, but of no meaningful contribution to the adventures that he had. And it's also, and this probably relates to why I borrowed the unsung hero from one of the books about Tom Crean, but the unsung hero, I think, is interesting because when you hear the tales of his adventures, it's extraordinary that he is so little known in comparison with some of the big names that you think of in relation to Antarctica, and particularly Robert Falcon Scott and Shackleton. But part of that, I think, is the fact that the relationships were different then. Relationships were different between nations. It was a time of great powers and empire before the First World War, and relationships were different between individuals, by which I mean the whole series of issues around rank and class, which have thankfully pretty much disappeared, and gender, which we're probably still struggling with a little bit, but we're trying hard, just were hugely important. So Crean, who wasn't one of the officer class and was from Ireland, although that wasn't that uncommon amongst this exploration group, it is probably less well known because of that. So the story, or the stories that weave through this man's life revolve around Antarctica. And I suspect you'll know a reasonable amount about Antarctica, but I'm going to give a little bit of colour, because Antarctica in the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, was probably essentially as remote as the moon was in the 1950s and 1960s. It had not been, nobody had stepped foot on Antarctica. It had been suspected since ancient times, so the notion of a terra australis, Aristotle speculated about. Captain Cook in the 1770s probably got within about 75 miles of Antarctica and saw ice and suspected there was something down there, thought it was probable that there was a great continent in the south, but never lived to see that proved. And it was first seen in 1820 by a Russian skipper called von Bellinghausen. But at the time of Crean's birth in 1877, nobody had actually stepped foot on Antarctica. Or at least we don't know they had. It is interesting that the history is written by the people who did the famous, typically sponsored expeditions, typically with a national flavour to them, so the British expedition, the Belgian expedition, etc. But one shouldn't forget there's a huge amount of commercial whaling and sealing going on in the Southern Ocean, and it may well be that truly unsung heroes did actually visit Antarctica before or around the time of the adventures I'll talk to you about. Antarctica is unbelievably remote. So it's more than 3,000 miles. You can see the tip of Africa, and that's more than 3,000 miles away. You can see Australia at about 4 o'clock, nearly 4,000 miles away. New Zealand's a little bit closer, but still more than 3,000 miles away. And the nearest land is the southern tip of South America. And nowadays, most commercial trips to Antarctica leave from Ushuaia in Argentina in a southern trip, but the southern tip of South America. But that's still 600 miles from the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, which you can see heading up at about 10 o'clock from the Antarctic landmass. And it's across the Drake Passage, which is, depending on your perspective, arguably the worst or most interesting piece of sea in the world, because so that the weather goes round clockwise as you're looking at it. And the only place on the planet where there's completely unimpeded weather systems going around is that ring that you can see around Antarctica. And there's a constriction, which is very obvious, between the Antarctic Peninsula and the southern tip of South America. And the Drake Passage is well known for appalling weather and massive seas. And of course, the southern tip of South America is Cape Horn. It's a dramatic and tempestuous and challenging place. And some of this story plays out in that arena. So Crean was part, or became part, and I'll go back to his early life in a little while, but Crean became part of what became known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, which stretched from between about 1897 to about 1920 and encompassed 7 expeditions over those 23 years from 10 separate countries. Obviously, the heroic age was retrospectively defined, but it was characterized by it still being at the end of this pre-mechanical age of exploration, so there's a lot of sail involved in getting there. All the ships did have engines, but they're still pretty slow. They were moving about 7 or 8 knots. It was, as I've kind of alluded to already, incredibly remote, so the technical support that a lot of modern Antarctic expeditions have was just simply unavailable, and it was also coloured by this context, which I've alluded to already, of empire and great powers and countries wishing to have their flag placed first on the South Pole once that became a target. The first 2 expeditions, I've touched a little bit on the ships already, but the ships that were used for these Antarctic expeditions are exclusively wooden. So this is properly old technology, and they've all, although they've got engines, they're pretty slow, and they've all got sail, and they've all got square rig, for goodness sake, which is something you don't see nowadays except in craft designed for nostalgia. And the 3 ships are almost as much part of the story as the people. Discovery, Scott's first ship, which still survives, and I'll come back to later, and the Terra Nova, which sadly sank, which was the rescue ship for Scott in his first expedition, but became his main ship in his second expedition, and then Endurance, around which probably Crean's most famous story revolves. Both Terra Nova and Endurance are now lost. So the expeditions started with the Belgians and the British simply landing on and starting to overwinter in Antarctica. At this time, still without an ambition to actually achieve the pole, which became the dominant competition, which I'm sure many of you will have heard the stories of in the first decade of the 20th century. The countries that ran the expeditions, you'll see the Union Jack runs through this strongly, and more than half of these expeditions were either British or Scottish or run by one of the colonies, so the joint Australia-New Zealand expedition. But there were several other countries, including the French, Norwegians, Swedes and Danes, and the Japanese and Germans, who were very keen to demonstrate their national superiority. The period of these expeditions closed with what became, we some now know, is Shackleton's last expedition, and I'll touch on that very briefly towards the end. As I've mentioned, the context geographically was one of empire, so the British Empire spanned a significant chunk of the globe, the famous red areas on the map, including large parts of North America, large parts of Africa, India, Australia, and the historical context, this is the time of Victoria when Tom Crean was born. And in an Irish context, it's in the aftermath of the Great Famine in the late 1840s, and actually the so-called Little Famine that occurred in 1879, just a couple of years after he was born. And it was a time of massive emigration and also massive degrees of illness and death in Ireland. So probably a quarter of the population were decimated by the Great Famine, either because they left the country or because they were killed by the extraordinary poverty that resulted from this. So this is the context in which Tom Crean grew up. And a context he was going into was, so at this time Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, but a growing feeling of dissatisfaction with that, a lot of problems over land regulations, absentee landlords, and the broader context being about the increasing tensions between the great powers and the coming of the First World War and the flu pandemic, somewhat resonant now, and Irish independence in the 1920s, all of which occurred during his lifetime in parallel with his expeditioning. So this tiny country in the Northern Hemisphere, dominating a huge amount of land and actually driving a lot of this expeditioning. And as I've said at the time, not particularly happily, but Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, and here is us. So this is the Dingle Peninsula, taken from Google Earth. So this is us in Dingle. If you came along the route from Kerry Airport, this is Inch Beach, that gorgeous long sandy beach, and this is Anaesthesia. I hope I've said it reasonably correctly. This is the village where Tom Crean grew up, and I'll just flag up a little castle down by the sea. I think it's called Midgin Castle, which becomes a character in this story in a moment. So, Tom Crean was born in Anaesthesia. This is an aerial shot of Anaesthesia, and in the foreground, so you can see the river and the bridge, and in the foreground, a blue building, which has recently been repainted, because this is a picture earlier this week of the South Pole Inn, which comes in towards the end of his story. And you can see in the windows of the South Pole Inn the names of the 3 expeditions that his name was particularly associated with. This is Anaesthesia many years ago, back in the 1870s, so just a couple of years before Tom Crean was born. It's still a reasonable sized settlement. And Tom was born, well, he's said to be born on the 20th of July, which would make a wonderful story because it's the same as Ed Hillary's birthday, but actually the more recent scholarship suggests he's actually born in February, which is a little bit of a shame. But he was born to a pretty poor family, one of 10 children, so 6 boys and 4 girls, into a life of relative poverty with basically a small holding, in a time of punitive rents from absentee landlords, lots of summary evictions, lots of emigration, as I've touched on. And Tom went briefly to school, but had left by the age of 12, and by all accounts didn't attend very much before that, so certainly didn't get much of a formal education. And about the age of 16, he got into a bit of trouble with his dad. So he was sent out by his dad to tend the cattle, and according to the story, which may be apocryphal, he left the gate open and the cows ate the potatoes, which I think if you're running a small holding is a complete disaster. And so he ran away. And he did what people did in that time, where the context was one of mass immigration. He ran away to sea. He went to the Royal Navy Coast Guard station at Minard Castle, which is why I flagged that up on the map, which is just 2 miles down the river and then along the coast a bit. And he was given money for a suit, and he joined the Navy, and he jumped onto a ship called Scapula. From there, he travelled down to Queenstown, then called Cobb, which is down near Cork, and became a boy second class, number 174699. And bear in mind, he wasn't a big lad. You see the pictures, and he looks an impressive, charismatic character, but he's only about just under 5'8". And Tom Crean went from Queenstown through a number of episodes of naval service on different ships. He was on a ship called HMS Devastation, went across to Portsmouth, saw a bit of the UK mainland, and then a ship called the Royal Arthur, went down, joined the Pacific Squadron, so started to see the world, was promoted to be ordinary seaman, was slowly progressing through the Navy, but without any sign that he was going to be an exceptional individual. And in fact, I think he progressed to ordinary seaman, he was promoted above that, and then he was demoted for some misdemeanour. And then he joined a ship called the Ringarooma, which happened to sail down to New Zealand and to Lyttelton, which is a harbour in southern New Zealand. And this was the catalyst that changed his life forever, because in Lyttelton Harbour was the Discovery on its way down to Antarctica. So Discovery was Robert Falcon Scott's first ship. He'd left the Isle of Wight in August, arrived in Lyttelton in November, so this is not rapid travel. These journeys are extraordinary in their timescale. And another naughty sailor ended up running away from the Discovery. They were short a man. They asked for a volunteer from local folk, and Tom Crean put his hand up and said, "I'll join in," and joined the Discovery. And a few days later, it sailed for Antarctica, and his life was quite clearly changed forever, as you hear the subsequent stories. And it turned out that the Discovery expedition was to involve characters that were completely central to a huge amount of subsequent Antarctic exploration. Scott was the boss. Ernest Shackleton was on the boat. Edward Wilson was on the boat, who was the doctor who walked to the pole with Scott. William Lashley was on the boat, who also walked to Scott. Frank Wild, who was Shackleton's deputy skipper for Endurance. All these characters were slowly building up their Antarctic experience. So, Discovery was an extraordinary expedition. The ambition at this time wasn't even to reach the pole. That was a step too far, but the ambition was to discover more of Antarctica, get a feel of the geography, understand a bit more about the ice barriers, because at this time, quite a few of the voyages of Discovery had got to the edge of the ice, but not actually got to land. And the objectives are fairly long and detailed, but they're also fairly nebulous. There wasn't a clear goal. It was go down there, have a look around, see what you can discover. But one of the things they were keen to do was see how far south they could get, even though the pole was not a clear goal. And in doing this, they did a huge amount of hauling, and of course they had men to haul, and then the officers would walk. And Crean became one of the key sledge haulers in this party. He was clearly pretty strong. He was clearly a very measured man of great temperament. So one of the quotes from this expedition was, "Crean was an Irishman with a fund of wit and an even temper which nothing disturbed." So during this expedition, he did 140 days of man hauling of sledges, which puts him, there were about 48 of them man hauling. He was the 7th most busy man hauler of sledges, but it's a huge amount of work in a really hostile environment. And briefly, so on the 11th of November, they were hauling south, leaving depots for the officers to subsequently go past. On the 11th of November, he passed what was the previous furthest south, so 78 degrees 50 minutes, which had been set a number of years earlier in 1900 by Karsten Borchgrevink on the Southern Cross expedition. So he became one of a handful of people who had gone furthest south. So he held that record. He only held it for about a couple of months because Scott, Shackleton and Wilson in the main expedition party passed their depot and went on to 82 degrees south, which was at that time the furthest south, towards the end of December. And Scott's journey with Shackleton and Wilson was 960 miles over 93 days from the edge of the ice in as far south as they could and out again. And again, as I read through all this stuff, the duration of time spent in an incredibly harsh environment is to me extraordinary. So, amongst other things, they discovered the Cape Crozier emperor penguin colony, and Crean was involved with Edward Wilson, the doctor, in a side expedition of several weeks going over to the colony, seeing the penguins and coming back again. And then, of course, they got stuck in the ice. So when Shackleton, Scott and Wilson away, the first relief boat arrived, which was a boat called Morning, and Discovery was completely stuck in the ice, couldn't be relieved, but what they did do was hang around and wait for Scott, Wilson and Shackleton to come back. They were in a shocking state. They had significant scurvy and they were completely debilitated. So Shackleton was sent off home as incapable of doing anything. Scott and Wilson stayed, and the Morning went off for a whole other season and wasn't able to get back till the next year. So from the first day that they stepped on the ice to the time when they finally were rescued by the Morning coming back again the following year and the Terra Nova with it, was more than 2 years. It's extraordinary. It's about 2 years and a week and a little bit that they existed on the ice in Antarctica for a chap who only 2 years earlier had just happened to arrive in New Zealand and happened to step onto this boat. So the end of the Discovery expedition in 1905 left Crean going back to normal life and served. He had a number of episodes of serving on different boats, but in 1906, Scott requested that Crean join him, and Crean spent the rest of that decade serving with Captain Scott on various ships, nothing to do with Antarctica, but he became a very respected member of Scott's crew. Scott was not at this time focusing going on back to Antarctica, but his relationship with Shackleton was deteriorating, and Shackleton, they were a little bit territorial about where they could go, and they had arguments about who could land in what area if they were doing an expedition. And Scott obviously saw Shackleton as a subordinate because he had been on the previous expedition, but Shackleton managed to raise some money and went off on the Nimrod expedition in 1907, 1908, 1909, so another 2-year odyssey, deliberately trying to get to the South Pole ahead of Scott and anybody else. And so Scott and Crean were periodically hearing news of this, and when they knew Shackleton had come back with actually very limited success, they hadn't got that far north, they got back to England, they heard this news, and Scott said to Crean, I think we need to go back. I think we need to have a better shot next. And Crean was the first person he asked to come with him on the Terra Nova expedition. So another expedition, I suspect you will have heard stories of this expedition from many of you from childhood, the story of the ill-fated Scott party that get to the pole, but they get to the pole after Amundsen. There are some extraordinary smaller stories buried within it. So there's a side trip known as the book written by Aspi Cherry Garrett Gerard, he called The Worst Journey on Earth. Now, arguably, I think that was the trip to the pole, but his side trip to the Emperor Penguin colony, where they collected some eggs and brought them back, was an extraordinary trip lasting several weeks through incredible hardship, which is just one small aspect of this expedition. So, Antarctica again, you've got the Ross ice shelf. And the challenge in getting to the pole is to, first of all, cross the Ross ice shelf, which they used to term the Great Ice Barrier. It itself, it's not a nice, smooth surface. It's a considerably challenging place to get across. And then you've got to get up the Beardmore Glacier, and then you've got to cross from there, top of the Beardmore Glacier, to the pole. And these are not insubstantial distances. So it's about 400 miles across the ice shelf, 120 miles up the barrier, and 300 further miles to get to the pole. And these are the maps from Scott's expedition, from the Terra Nova expedition, describing that journey. There's a huge amount of preamble I won't go into, but the final journey was a sort of pyramid structure with lots of people setting off and progressively fewer and fewer until they finally, a bit like a rocket going to the moon, dropping off the support stages, until finally 5 of them had a shot at going to the pole. So they set off with 16 men, having established a number of camps over the preceding months. They'd aimed to use, and this is part of the story that's often told, they'd aimed to use motorised transport. So they had little early motorised sledges that they hadn't really prototyped and proved to be almost completely ineffective. So they didn't really contribute in terms of the carrying of things. And they did have ponies and they did have dogs, but They had very limited experience with dogs, which was in contrast with Amundsen's lot, who had a huge amount of experience back home in trekking with dogs. And the ponies weren't that great either, and in the end they got shot and eaten. So it was a very hard trip involving somewhat ineffectual use of dogs, occasional use of ponies, and a lot of man-hauling again. And as I mentioned, progressively more and more people dropped off. Heading into the 11th of December, the last dogs dropped off. The 22nd of December, 3 more folk left. So they're now 231 miles from the pole at 85 degrees north, and 4 more people headed south. And then the last group to head south, before Scott and Wilson and Evans and the others went off to the pole, were another Evans. There were 2 Evans on the trip, William Lashley and Tom Crean. So Tom Crean got right to the very end before the final group left for the pole, and is said to have actually cried on the ice when Scott said, "You're going back, these guys going forward." And it may well be that it was his relatively lowly beginnings in Ireland as opposed to his sort of officer heritage that was part of that decision, because it did seem that he, along with some of the others that had gone back, were actually stronger than some of the party that ultimately went to the pole. So the story of the trip to the pole is desperately sad in many ways. They finally get to the pole. They discover the flag and the tent that Amundsen's left, Amundsen having already got there on the 16th of December, having had a very quick and efficient, largely dog-supported trip in and out, and was already off on his way home. Rather dismal picture of Scott and his team at the pole, and then they tried to head back. First of all, across the polar plateau, then they've got to descend the Beardmore Glacier, which they succeed in doing, but at an ever slower pace with pretty adverse conditions. They lose Evans at the base of the Beardmore, so we're now into February. This is halfway through February. They got to the pole in December, they set out in November. So they lose Evans in the middle of February, and they're now creeping forward, forgive the metaphor, but at a truly glacial pace. On the 16th of March, Oates does his legendary, "I'm just going to go outside, I may be some time." And on the 20th of March, they finally completely grind to a halt. And on the 29th of March, tragically only 11 miles from the so-called 1-ton depot, which was their resupply point, they died. And we know that because their bodies were rediscovered, and there was a reasonably full journal account of that. Now, it wasn't that easy being in the party that left before they went to the pole. So William Lashley, Lieutenant Evans, and Tom Crean, being the last 3 to turn back, they got within 160 miles of the pole, and they had to do the same. They had to try and get back to 1-ton depot. Evans, the military captain, became increasingly weak, became snowblind, and he, as has been very common on these expeditions, also developed scurvy. So Lashley and Crean were basically supporting Evans and started to feel like they weren't going to, they clearly didn't know what happened to Scott's party, but they started to feel like they were going to struggle to get back. And they also ground to a halt 35 miles, this is a couple of months beforehand, before Scott's lot came back, 35 miles from Hut Point. And Crean then did this extraordinary walk 25 miles from Hut Point. He did this extraordinary walk over 18 hours on his own through a blizzard and got back to Hut Point and found 2 others of the party there with some dogs and turned around and went and rescued Lashley and Evans, for which he got something called the Albert Medal for Bravery. But that in itself, leaving aside his performance already on the Discovery expedition, would one have thought merited him being extraordinarily famous. So his actions through going non-stop through a blizzard with nothing, so no food, nothing, saved the lives of Lashley and Evans, who were successfully rescued in contrast to the Polar Party. So Crean came back, obviously amongst that polar community, now a little bit of a legend and highly desirable. Scott had not succeeded going to the pole. Amundsen obviously had, so that was no longer a target. But Shackleton still had a thirst for Antarctic exploration and now wanted to be the first to cross Antarctica. So there's always a new challenge. And supposedly, now it's a real shame, this is the famous advert. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honour and recognition in case of success. It's apparently entirely apocryphal. So there's a lot of people have done a lot of work trying to find the original advert. I don't know who came up with it because it's a brilliant story, but there is actually no evidence that this advert was ever placed anywhere. And most of Shackleton's team were known to him personally from previous expeditions. So in fact, he probably just went around and spoke to his old friends and got them involved, which is a shame because it's a lovely story. And here's Crean again. And Crean was a very highly valued member of Shackleton's team. He seems to have been a very respected, loved member of that team. And he also took the job of looking after the dogs. So part of his endurance journey involved bringing up the pups of the dogs that were going to be part of the sledging crew. Again, the duration of these things is extraordinary. They left Plymouth on the 8th of August 1914, so just a few days after the outbreak of the First World War. They got to South Georgia in November, and they reached Antarctica in December. And there is a second team in a ship called Aurora who've gone around to the other side of the continent, the aim of which is to set up camps that they will be able to traverse the continent and get to. And their aim, and they're on the opposite side to the Ross Shelf, which is what we looked at before with Scott, their aim is to get across from the Weddell Sea over the whole continent and get to the Ross Shelf and then get themselves out of there. But it didn't work out too well. They became entangled in pack ice in late December. They got completely stuck. Things looked a little bit better and they had an opportunity to maybe steam south to land in January for about 3 days, and then they got stuck firm in January of 1915. The Endurance was never to sail again, so it was stuck firm in ice for some months before it finally sank, and they drifted unbelievably slowly. So they managed 95 miles in the 2.5 months to the end of March, for example. And they were still drifting at the end of September, so over a whole Antarctic winter. They shifted most of the equipment off the boat onto the ice. They'd kept themselves fit, they were reasonably well nourished, but the ship was taking an increasing hammering, and when the ice started to melt in the winter and started to move around more, the ship got increasingly squeezed and eventually started to sink, and they abandoned the ship towards the end of October. Didn't sink immediately, so they set up a camp, had taken everything off the ship. They were still able to go in their lifeboats, they had 3 small lifeboats, they were still able to go back onto the ship and take bits of wood and that kind of thing. And they had with them some very good carpenters, and in fact, a marine carpenter who was able to build and fix the lifeboats. So they spent this extraordinary amount of time before the Endurance finally sank below the ice. And again, you've probably heard the bones of this story before, but they then had this extraordinary drift without the ship on ice, including some man-hauling. And this is an old map. I'm going to show you the modern map because it gives a somewhat better perspective, and it gives you the timelines. So they lose the ship in October. They are drifting on ice, occasionally having to go between bits of ice with these 3 lifeboats. In fact, they had 2 lifeboats. They went quite a distance, and then they went back to get the third. So the whole experience of it sounds extraordinary until they finally get to the edge of the ice, and then they have an open boat journey in these 3 lifeboats to get to Elephant Island. They're the first people who've ever been to Elephant Island. Nobody's set foot on it before. They succeed in arriving on Elephant Island in April of, we're now in 1916. So extraordinary length of time. And there are some photographs of this. So they arrived on Elephant Island. This is the James Caird arriving on Elephant Island. The 2 other lifeboats they turned upside down and made homes for the team on Elephant Island. It's nice to get to Elephant Island, but it was still 550 miles away from South America and a very substantial way from, and by the way, you can't go to South America because the wind and the sea are all going from west to east, so there's no possible way of getting to South America. And they are effectively stuck on Elephant Island unless they come up with a plan. And as you probably know, the plan was that they go to South Georgia. I always find it interesting when you look at these maps because it looks not too difficult on a very large scale map to go across to South Georgia, particularly when you draw on the line of the way they went. If you then just take the map, so Elephant Island is down by the South Shetlands. You can see the Antarctic Peninsula at about 7 o'clock in this, and the South Shetlands are the very small islands above that. And then they're trying to get across to South Georgia, which is the very small island, up at about 2 o'clock. And they're navigating in an open boat, which is only just over 20 foot long, doing that using sun sights. And the weather's really bad, so sun sights are rare. And South Georgia is 800 nautical miles away. And a nautical mile, in case you didn't know, is a little bit longer than a statute mile, a land mile. So it's nearly 900 land miles away from where they are on Elephant Island. And they set off in the James Caird, which was their one remaining completely or largely intact lifeboat. They spent some time increasing its freeboard, so they added to the sides, they covered over a little bit, they filled it up with food, and then 6 of them headed off across the sea. And the choice of the 6 is interesting. So Shackleton went, he took Crean with him, I think because of both his temperament and his strength and his resilience and his demonstrated capacity to withstand real adversity on 2 previous expeditions. He took Frank Worsley, who was the skipper of Endurance, or had a very successful career in the New Zealand Navy. So he wasn't a Brit, he was a Kiwi, but a career in the New Zealand Navy and had a reputation of being an extraordinary navigator. So he'd earned his trade going around the South Pacific, finding very small islands in the middle of very large areas of sea. So Frank was an obvious choice because he was the navigator extraordinaire. He took Harry McNeish because he was known as the Chippy, but also because he was one of the troublemakers. So McNeish, when they originally got off the ship and went onto the ice, had threatened rebellion and had said, well, our contracts no longer stand because our contracts relate to the ship. The ship's gone down, you can't tell us what to do. That didn't last, but McNeish also hated Shackleton because when they went on the ice, McNeish had Mrs. Chippy, the cat, and Shackleton had Mrs. Chippy shot, along with most of the dogs, and McNeish never forgave him. So the belief is that he took Harry McNeish not particularly because of his ability to fix the boat, but because if he left him behind, he'd be a troublemaker. And the same applies to John Vincent, who was a chap from Birmingham who was the biggest guy on the trip. He'd been the bosun until he was demoted for being a bully, and he was someone else who was taken probably because he was a troublemaker rather than for his asset to the trip. And then he took Tim McCarthy, who was a Kinsale boy, one of the youngest members of the expedition, who was there for positive reasons, I think because he thought he would be strong. The first time I gave this lecture, or a variant of it, was in Antarctica. I was really lucky. There are a couple of Australians in the audience. They do have extraordinary study leave budgets. And I was lucky enough to be invited to be a speaker on a sort of Australian Dingle, which was on this ship you can see here. So this is the National Geographic Explorer on a 2-week, inverted commas, conference. It's completely unfair. On a 2-week conference, which had high educational content, but in a most extraordinary environment that went from Ushuaia down to Antarctica, and we were able to step onto the Antarctic Peninsula. And the only downside of it can be said to be a downside is the first time I gave this lecture, it was interrupted about halfway through with a shout of "Whales, whales," and everybody ran to the windows, and we had about a 10-minute pause, and then we restarted. And you can see one of the reasons I've shown it is, so National Geographic Explorer is a modern, it's not an icebreaker, but it's an ice ship that is capable of, and did when we were on it, capable of driving into the ice shelf and just parking, and you can open the door at the side and get out and go for a walk. It's about 365 foot long, and you can see at the top 2 arrows. So the long arrow is the Explorer, and the short arrow is the James Caird. So you can fit the James Caird, if you can see that arrow again now, you can fit the James Caird in the overhang of the bow of the National Geographic Explorer. It's a tiny, tiny vessel to go through these sort of seas. And it was extraordinarily cramped. So this is a diagram of all the stuff they shoved in, plus 6 people in 22 foot. And any of you who've been on boats will know that that's a very tight fit to spend many, many days at sea. And the conditions were remarkably hostile. And this is a sketch. They did have a camera with them, but they weren't using the camera in these sort of conditions. But Shackleton describes, and Worsley described, the worst seas they've ever seen during one of the storms just before they arrived in South Georgia. So not only is it an extraordinary feat of navigation, with only 3 sunshots during the duration of the voyage of 800 nautical miles, but it's under conditions of profound adversity. And just imagine being in those sort of conditions in a 20-foot, 22-foot open boat sailing. I mean, it's always an impressive story, but having seen the Drake Passage and the conditions that can be there, it feels like an even more impressive story. So they finally get to South Georgia. They departed on the 24th of April. They'd had sun sights, so their only navigational fixes on the 26th of April, the 29th of April, and the 4th of May to get to this pretty small target. The big storm's on the 8th of May, and they finally get to South Georgia. Although they can see it from the 8th of May, they don't get to land until the 10th, and then they rest up a little bit. 2 of them are completely debilitated. So Vincent and the Chippy are basically broken men. They've got scurvy, and they've really struggled to do anything in the boat, and they're both in quite a lot of pain. And McCarthy, who's the young lad, is still okay, but they leave McCarthy behind. The Chippy is still just about able to do bits and pieces, so he takes some screws out of the boat and puts them into the boots of Worsley and Shackleton and Crean, because they're faced with a particular challenge, which is that they're on the wrong side of South Georgia, and nobody's ever crossed South Georgia before. So they set off, and they cross South Georgia, which doesn't sound that impressive until you understand. So the geography is extraordinary. It's glaciated, big alpine mountains. About 100 years later, an attempt was made to mimic this expedition. So the 3 guys here are 3 heroes of mine. So the big smiling all-American guy is Conrad Anker. The chap in the middle with the beard is Reinhold Messner. And the gentleman in the spectacles is Stephen Venables. Stephen Venables was one of the first Brits up Everest, but he's certainly the first up the Kanchung Face, which hadn't been climbed before. He bivouacked high on Everest. He's a legendary British climber, hugely accomplished. Conrad Anker is a hugely experienced, very strong American climber. He's been up Everest several times. And Reinhold Messner is an extraordinary character who was first to climb Everest without supplemental oxygen, first to climb all 14 8,000-metre peaks. He's an incredibly strong climber. And they went to make a movie for IMAX and try and get across South Georgia as fast as they could about 7-8 years ago now. And it took them about a day and a half longer than it took Crean and Worsley and Shackleton in 1916. So they somehow, after all the experiences they'd lived through, they managed to get across the island. They, by all accounts, were in a pretty shocking state when they arrived in Stromness, which is the settlement on the far side. Dirty, bearded, bedraggled, weak. And even the detail of that journey is extraordinary in itself. They at one point could see Stromness but couldn't work out how to get down. They were on a glacier and they basically just let go. They had a big slide, no knowledge of what was below them, and they got away with it. So they succeeded in getting across South Georgia. They succeeded in going back round to the other side and rescuing the other three. They succeeded in going back to Elephant Island, and they borrowed a ship from the Chileans called Yelcho and got back to Elephant Island by August. So the poor chaps from Elephant Island had an even longer stay. Frank Wilde, who was the deputy skipper, picked them up, and they all managed to come home about halfway through the First World War. And again, there was harm from the First World War, but the story I've always taken is that half of them went off to war and were killed. In fact, that's not true. There were individuals, or one individual in particular, who did, but actually most of them lived into reasonable old age. So, what happened to everybody? Well, the James Caird, as some of you know, is still intact and was brought back to the United Kingdom and sits in Dulwich College. The Discovery is still intact and sits in Dundee, and you can look around it. The Terra Nova was lost in a big storm off Greenland in the 1940s and basically started taking on water. The engine stopped and the American Coast Guard rescued everybody on board, but the Terra Nova was clearly completely failing, so they set it on fire and it sank. And 100 years, not to the day, so 100 years later exactly, the Smith Institute in America were testing out some new sonar devices, and they thought, why don't we go and have a look and see if we can find the Terra Nova? And they did. So Terra Nova is a few hundred meters down off Greenland, in a pretty bad state. It's rolled over on its side and fairly degraded, but we now know where the Terra Nova is. And the Endurance was obviously lost forever. It's in about 3.5 miles of water below the Weddell Sea in Antarctica. Only it turns out it's not lost forever. There's an extraordinary expedition, not led by Dan Snow, but involving Dan Snow, the television historian, skippered by, and I've just forgotten his name, but the first black South African ice skipper, so incredibly competent ice skipper, who went looking for Endurance. They had some amazing submarine drone technology, and they searched around for many weeks, in fact, last year, and finally discovered the Endurance. And the Endurance is almost perfectly intact. It's obviously a bit broken because it was a bit broken from being squashed in the ice, but it is sitting there on flat seabed at the bottom of the sea, almost perfectly intact. They didn't touch it at all, but they've completely, I don't know if it's lasers, but they've completely scanned it. So the ambition is to create a virtual Endurance. Apparently, there's a huge amount of pictures, and in fact, there's an IMAX movie coming of this as well, but it's apparently in extraordinarily good condition. It was rediscovered in March of this year, and there's a film of that coming out soon. Of the people, Vincent, who was the bully, who travelled, I'm just going to focus on the six, not the whole party, but Vincent, who was the bully, he successfully travelled back to the UK. He wasn't killed in the First World War. He came back, he was married, and he died in the 1940s without any adverse event. McNeish was not celebrated in the United Kingdom, but went back to New Zealand, where he was from, and was celebrated there. He's buried in New Zealand in a grave with Mrs. Chippy sitting on the grave, and he again lived into the 1940s. Shackleton didn't do so well. As you probably know, so Shackleton came back to England after the Endurance expedition and couldn't get rid of the bug, so he managed to get support from someone called Rowlett. So the Shackleton-Rowlett expedition headed off in early 1922, and he got as far as South Georgia, and he was in Grytviken, and having had a somewhat stormy medical course along the way. So he'd had a heart attack in the UK before he left, probably had a heart attack in Argentina on the way, and got to South Georgia, and the quotes of his final minutes talking to his doctor's a chap called Macklin, was, "You always wanted me to give up things. What is it I ought to give up, Macklin? Chiefly alcohol, boss. I don't think it agrees with you." Shortly later, he had a very severe paroxysm and then died. So Shackleton died on South Georgia. They started bringing his body back towards England, but Mrs. Shackleton said, honestly, don't worry. So they turned him around and buried him on South Georgia, which is where he's buried now. Frank Worsley also did well, survived the First World War and had a successful naval career, including re-enlisting and lying about his age during the Second World War, and he died in the 1960s. Timothy McCarthy, who was one of actually two celebrated brothers. His brother, Mort McCarthy, is also on the Terra Nova expedition, but Timothy McCarthy came back, joined the Royal Naval Reserve, went to sea, and on the 16th of March 1917 was killed at sea in the first action that he ever saw. So he was the tragic story that gives some truth to that myth. And Crean came back. He served a little time in the Merchant Navy. He was invalided out with eyesight problems after an accident in 1920. He married. He had 3 daughters. One of them died in early childhood, but 2 of them survived him. He was, from all accounts, very happily married. And he and his wife bought a pub. And the pub is just down the road in the South Pole Inn in our school. You can go and visit it. It's an easy trip. It's got wonderful memorabilia on the walls. It tells much of this story there. And Shackleton died in the late 1930s. Sadly, this is probably one of the few medical diversions. He sadly probably died from poor emergency laparotomy care. So he had acute appendicitis, was transferred up to, or sent up to Tralee, and they couldn't find a surgeon, so there was a delayed secondary transfer to the Bon Secours in Cork, where it was too late to operate, and he developed peritonitis and died shortly thereafter. That's pretty much the end of the story. I'm not sure it's possible to conclude really such an extraordinary set of tales, but my only reflections are, what an extraordinary man, what an extraordinary hero. His experiences, the level of danger. So on the 17 expeditions in the heroic age, 19 people died. Most of the expeditions were somewhere between 30 and 60 people. So the level of danger, the mortality is very comparable with the space age or with the era of the first ascents of Everest. The duration is extraordinary. So 2-year-plus expeditions in extraordinary isolation and absolutely remarkable acts of personal bravery, spanning a historical time that showed that was part of extraordinary change with the collapse of empire and the independence of Ireland, amongst other things, and really is probably a wonderful example of a life well lived by an extraordinary adventurer who settled down and became a family man and a very modest member of his community. He, by all accounts, didn't tell tales. The people of Anaesthesia weren't aware of the significance of his activities till after he died, but he died a happy man. So, thank you very much for listening, and I would be delighted to take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
All that time on the ice, when they're there for years on end, what did they live off?
They took a huge amount of food with them. They took a lot of tinned food with them, which, as an aside, on other expeditions, notably the Arctic lot, death from poisoning from tins, including tin poisoning and mercury poisoning, is not unknown on expeditions. They did eat the dogs. They didn't eat any people, in contrast to some of the Arctic expeditions, but they had ships that were filled to the gunwales with supplies. I mean, there's no meaningful life. The fauna of Antarctica will not sustain anybody. There are penguins, but not where they were, because they were drifting in the Weddell Sea. So penguins are on land, and there was little prospect of fishing because the ice was pretty solid the whole time. So they were living off the supplies that they had with them, which they were slowly running out of, until they got to Elephant Island. At Elephant Island, they were able to start getting some fish and some birds, but mostly living on the supplies they took with them.
Presumably, I mean, scurvy was obviously an issue at various stages. Presumably, the cause and treatment was known at this stage, was it? And was it just simply they couldn't carry enough citrus or whatever to stave it off?
I mean, I think they probably could have. I think they didn't pay sufficient attention to it. I don't think they were anticipating it in a polar environment. I guess one of the things is, unlike, say generally on a ship, you're not working that hard because the ship is sailing around a power, whereas if you're dragging your metabolic turnover, you're dragging sledges to the pole and back, is probably substantially higher. So maybe it's complete speculation, but maybe that's why they have particular problems.
I think for me, if I can just sort of finish off, it's amazing to sit back and just reflect on just what they were trying to do. And there's almost flavours of futility to some of it. I mean, there's this mixture of amazing heroism and a desire to do something that's never been achieved before. But some of the ways that perhaps the planning fell short, or, there's a real feeling that perhaps sometimes were they thinking, God, are we just doing something completely crazy here? So
the motivations are really interesting. I mean, there's a huge amount of straightforward nationalism in the Scott and Shackleton expeditions were typically supported by the Royal Geographical Society and sometimes the Royal Society as well. I mean, you can see the majority of the expeditions were British or British linked and involved huge investments of money, and a lot of that was national pride. And I think the other issues of class and rank are not trivial, because it's not entirely clear, and this is really, the memories of Scott and Shackleton are very treasured by particular groups of people. So people get very upset if you talk badly of Scott or badly of Shackleton. But I mean, it's not entirely clear that Scott, for example, was expert in polar travel. Although he'd been to the poles, it is very clear that the Norwegians were much more expert at getting around and looking after themselves, and they were quicker up in all sections of the trip. They're quicker down, and everybody survived. So although we may have had resource and ambition, we may not have been the most competent as a nation in our endeavours. Crean's story is extraordinary. But the expeditions with which he was involved were all essentially failures. None of them achieved the goals they set out to achieve. So the original Discovery expedition, it did in part because it had fairly nebulous goals. But, Scott got to the pole, but he wasn't first, and they all died. And Shackleton never even managed to get onto land on Antarctica. They drifted around a lot and did an extraordinary journey, which is an amazing story, but it wasn't a great success.
That's great. Okay, well, time has marched on. Just one last thanks to Mike for a fantastic start to the day. Thanks, Mike.
TopMedTalk. Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now.